The swamp lands of the Jurassic stirred beneath the rising sun. Mist clung to reeds while herds of plant eaters waded through shallow pools. Silence stretched heavy until the surface rippled with sudden force. From the shadows of tangled trees emerged a predator with a horn jutting from its snout like a blade of stone. Ceratosaurus moved low and steadied its tail, cutting the air with each step. Eyes locked on the herd, it turned the marsh into a trap of terror. One mistake from the prey would be enough. The king of the swamp had arrived. The Jurassic dawn rose over a swamp that seemed both beautiful and dangerous. Shafts of light pierced through tall ferns, casting pale reflections across the water. Mist curled low around pools and reeds swayed, as if whispering warnings to one another. The air carried the scent of damp earth mixed with the musk of countless creatures that depended on this land. Every ripple upon the surface spoke of hidden life. Insects hovered above still water, their wings glittering like fragments of glass. Frogs leapt from stone to stone, leaving small rings upon the ponds. Yet beneath all this life hung the shadow of a ruler. Herds of plant eaters gathered along the water's edge. Stegosaurus swung their tails slowly while feeding on low shrubs. Young sauropods stretched their necks to strip soft branches from swamp trees. Iguanodon herds moved nervously, their heads lifting at every sound. They knew the swamp provided water and food, yet they also knew its dangers. For hidden among the reeds and beneath the shadows of trees lay a predator unlike any other. Ceratosaurus was forged by this land. Its body was long and sleek, built for power as much as for speed. Dark scales pressed close against its frame, glistening faintly with swamp moisture. A long tail acted as a counterweight, shifting balance in each silent step. Its teeth were long and curved like knives designed to tear through flesh with brutal efficiency. Yet what marked it as unique was the single horn rising above its snout. The horn was not built to gore like a triceratops, yet it gave Ceratosaurus a fearsome look. In the swamp where shadows distorted shape, the horn made the predator appear almost mythical. The swamp was not easy territory. Mud pulled at the feet of every creature. Pools turned treacherous with sudden drops. Crocodile-like hunters lurked in the deeper waters, waiting for prey to wander too close. To rule this place required patience as much as power. Ceratosaurus had both. Its hunts were not reckless rushes. It stalked with precision, moving in silence, broken only by the faint slap of its tail through reeds. Each step was calculated to test the herd, to sense weakness, to find the one mistake that would allow a clean strike. On this morning, the predator moved along a narrow ridge of earth, rising just above the waterline. Its head shifted slowly from side to side, eyes locked upon the herds that drank by the pool. The mist offered cover though the sun threatened to burn it away. Timing was everything. Too soon and the herd would scatter. Too late and the sun would strip away the shadows. A young iguanodon strayed from the safety of its herd. It bent low to drink, its tail swaying lazily. Ceratosaurus lowered itself almost to the mud, its horned head dipping as it measured the distance. Muscles coiled in its legs, ready to unleash a sudden burst of speed. For a heartbeat, the swamp froze. Birds ceased their calls. Even insects seemed to hover in midair. Yet the strike never came. The predator halted. Its nostrils flared, catching a scent carried across the water. Something else moved within the swamp. Not prey, but a rival. The air carried the musk of another hunter, large and dangerous. Ceratosaurus lifted its head, slightly scanning the distant trees. The iguanodon herd sensed a change and retreated from the water, their tails flicking in alarm. The chance of the kill was gone. Yet Ceratosaurus did not move in frustration. Instead, it remained still listening. Rival signs had grown more frequent in recent weeks. Tracks pressed deep into the mud spoke of another predator that crossed these swamps. Bones scattered near the river hinted at a kill made not by Ceratosaurus, but by another set of jaws. The swamp was rich, but not rich enough for two rulers. Survival would demand more than stealth. It would demand strength. Ceratosaurus retreated into the shadows of the trees. Each step was deliberate as it returned to higher ground where the swamp thinned into forest. From there it could observe the land and scent the wind. The predator knew hunger was rising within its belly, yet hunger could wait. To rush was to risk failure. And failure in this land meant more than losing a meal. It meant offering weakness for rivals to exploit. As the sun climbed higher, the swamp awakened in full. Herds moved to deeper pools, while flocks of flying reptiles wheeled overhead. The chorus of life grew louder, yet beneath the calls and rustles lay a rhythm of caution. Every creature here lived with the knowledge that the horned predator walked these grounds. Each footfall of Ceratosaurus shaped the behavior of prey herds. Each pause in its movement shifted the silence of the swamp. The land itself seemed to bend around its presence. For now the predator settled beneath the shade of a broad tree. Its chest rose and fell with steady breaths. Its eyes closed only halfway, still watchful even in rest. The swamp carried endless possibilities for both feast and danger. The horn upon its snout gleamed faintly in the filtered light. To some creatures it was a symbol of terror. To others it was a final sight before death. Yet to Ceratosaurus it was simply part of its being forged by ages of survival within a land that demanded nothing less than perfection. The introduction of this predator into the swamp did not happen in isolation. Its presence was felt across valleys and ridges where echoes of its roar carried. The prey had adapted to move in cycles around its hunting grounds. Even the crocodile, like hunters of the pools, shifted their habits to avoid encounters. Yet one truth remained. Ceratosaurus had not reached the peak of its power by avoiding conflict. It had risen by enduring it. The horned predator stood as a living reminder that only the most relentless survived the trials of the Jurassic. And as shadows shortened and heat pressed down upon the swamp, Ceratosaurus stirred once more. Its hunger demanded action. Its patience demanded precision. Somewhere in the dense marsh another predator walked, and the swamp was not wide enough for both. The days ahead would test not only its skill, but its very claim to this land. The sun burned hot above the swamp as the day stretched forward. Mist had lifted, leaving the land exposed. Pools that shimmered at dawn now reflected harsh light, and the air thickened with humidity. Herds remained close to water, though they moved restlessly. Their tails swished at insects, yet their eyes flicked constantly toward the trees. Fear lived in their every movement, for the horned predator stalked the swamp with hunger pressing its ribs. Ceratosaurus moved along the forest edge, keeping low. Its nostrils caught the heavy scent of prey drifting across the reeds. Ahead, an iguanodon herd waded into a shallow pool. Younglings splashed under the guard of adults, their tails forming a defensive wall. Ceratosaurus crept closer, each foot sinking silently into the wet earth. Muscles tightened and eyes narrowed. The predator launched with sudden force. Mud sprayed behind its powerful legs as it surged forward. The herd erupted in chaos, water churning with flailing limbs. Ceratosaurus snapped at a youngling, its jaws closing around nothing but spray. An adult swung its tail, striking the predator's side. Pain shot through its ribs, yet the predator pressed onward. Again its jaws snapped, and again the prey evaded. The ground betrayed the hunter. Mud sucked at its feet, slowing each bound. The herd stampeded toward the forest, their bodies crashing through reeds. Ceratosaurus lunged one final time, but the distance widened. Its jaws snapped shut on empty air as the last tail disappeared into safety. Breathing hard, the predator halted, chest heaving with exertion. Failure burned sharper than hunger. For a long moment, Ceratosaurus stood still in the shallows. Water dripped from its horn and teeth. Blood welled where the tail strike had left a deep bruise. Yet it did not collapse. Failure was a lesson. The swamp punished recklessness. Ceratosaurus retreated to the ridge to lick its wounds beneath shadow. Hunger gnawed deeper, but patience forced it to wait. Hours passed before another chance arose. Along the far bank, a small ornithopod strayed alone from its group. It bent low to feed on tender shoots, unaware of eyes watching from the reeds. Ceratosaurus shifted silently, each step measured. Distance closed slowly until the moment came. With explosive force, the predator charged. Mud flew as its jaws struck true. The small prey shrieked once before silence claimed it. Teeth tore flesh clean and blood spilled into the swamp water. The kill was swift and merciless. Ceratosaurus fed until its belly grew heavy. Yet the meal was small, and hunger still lingered. It was enough to restore strength, but not to ease the ache of scarcity. The predator lifted its head, blood dripping from its horn. Across the water, scavenger birds circled, waiting for scraps. With a guttural snarl, Ceratosaurus dragged the carcass into deeper reeds to finish its feast in solitude. That night a storm swept across the swamp. Clouds thickened until the moon vanished. Wind bent trees and rain hammered the pools. Water surged into rivers, overflowing banks. Trails washed away under torrents, and mudslides carved new paths through ridges. The swamp that had once been a map of familiar hunts transformed into a maze of shifting ground. For prey, this was disaster. For predators, it was opportunity. At dawn, Ceratosaurus rose from its shelter soaked but alive. Hunger sharpened again as scents drifted across fresh mud. A young sauropod lay trapped in a flooded hollow, struggling to climb free. Ceratosaurus approached, eyes locked on the massive prey. Risk shimmered across the scene. The young was huge, yet weakened by water and panic. Hunger urged a strike. Caution whispered danger. The predator lunged anyway. Claws slashed against thick hide, drawing blood. The sauropod bellowed, thrashing wildly. A tail swept with crushing force, striking Ceratosaurus across the shoulder. Pain seared and the predator staggered, yet clamped its jaws into flesh. The swamp became a frenzy of water and blood. After a brutal struggle, the young giant collapsed into the pool, its strength spent. Victory belonged to Ceratosaurus, yet the triumph was costly. Its shoulder burned with deep wounds, and each breath came heavy. For 2 days the predator remained near the carcass, feeding and resting. Flies swarmed and scavengers gathered, yet none dared challenge directly. Each step from the kill left trails of blood across the mud. Wounds slowed movement, yet hunger demanded constant risk. Ceratosaurus endured by sheer will, dragging its battered body through the swamp. It was during these slow hunts that the rival revealed itself more clearly. Prints larger than its own pressed deep into the mud along a riverbank. Fresh scat marked territory not far from its hunting ground. One evening, as the sun dipped low, a distant roar rolled across the swamp. The sound was deep and resonant, carrying challenge and warning both. Ceratosaurus froze, listening as the echo faded. This was no crocodile, no minor predator. It was another Ceratosaurus. The presence of a rival shifted the swamp. Herds moved differently, their trails weaving between territories. Prey became harder to corner as fear spread. Every hunt carried the risk of encounter. At night, Ceratosaurus lifted its head and roared in answer, its voice sharp and defiant. The swamp no longer belonged to one predator. It was a battlefield divided by sound, scent, and blood. Scarcity deepened as weeks passed. Pools shrank under relentless heat, and storms grew rarer. Prey grew thinner, ribs visible beneath their hides. Herds no longer lingered at water's edge, but moved constantly in search of safety. Ceratosaurus grew lean again, hunger hollowing its flanks. Yet the scars across its shoulder and ribs hardened into proof of endurance. One evening, the predator stalked a group of iguanodon crossing a clearing. The wind shifted, carrying its scent too soon. The herd bolted before it closed a gap. Ceratosaurus gave chase, yet slowed as pain flared in old wounds. The prey vanished into forest shadows, leaving silence once more. Breath ragged, the predator halted, its horn dripping with sweat and rain. Hunger pressed harder than ever. As night fell, the swamp whispered with the presence of its rival. Heavy steps echoed faintly across the water. Shadows moved beyond the reeds. The scent was strong, undeniable. Ceratosaurus lowered its head, growling softly. The time for avoidance was over. The swamp would not hold two rulers. The predator rested that night beneath a canopy of trees, muscles trembling, yet spirit unbroken. Dreams of hunts and battles flickered across its mind. At dawn it would rise not only to feed, but to face the challenge that had grown closer each day. The swamp demanded a ruler, and Ceratosaurus would answer that demand with tooth, claw, and roar. The swamp awoke to a silence that felt unnatural. No birds cried from the trees, and no herds lingered near the pools. Only the thick weight of stillness pressed down across the land. Ceratosaurus stood at the edge of a clearing, its horned head lifted high as nostrils drank in the air. The scent was fresh and strong. The rival was near. Mud squelched beneath heavy steps. A shape emerged from the far side of the swamp, reeds parting as a massive body pushed through. It was another Ceratosaurus, larger, with scars carved across its hide. A deep wound along its jaw showed survival of many battles. Its horn gleamed under the dim sun, like a blade forged for war. The two predators locked eyes. Neither moved at first. The swamp itself seemed to hold its breath, as though every creature watched in fear. Hunger had driven both to this moment. The swamp was not vast enough for two hunters of such power. Territory would belong to one alone. Ceratosaurus lowered its head and let out a sharp roar that cut through the silence. The sound echoed across trees, startling flocks of birds into the sky. The rival answered with a deeper roar, shaking the very water at their feet. It was a sound of dominance and fury. Then both charged. The ground shook with their thunderous steps as mud flew under claws. They collided with bone-shattering forest jaws, snapping and claws raking flesh. Ceratosaurus struck, first biting into the rival's flank. Blood sprayed, yet the larger predator twisted with brutal power. Its head swung wide, horns slamming into Ceratosaurus' shoulder. Pain tore through bone and muscle, yet the predator did not release its grip. The swamp erupted into chaos. Water churned as both predators crashed into a shallow pool. Teeth tore at scales and claws carved across flesh. Each roar rolled like thunder over the land. Herds miles away lifted their heads, sensing the battle of titans. The larger rival forced Ceratosaurus underwater. Bubbles rose as jaws clamped tight around its neck. For a moment the world blurred into panic and suffocation. Yet instinct and fury drove the predator upward. With a violent surge, Ceratosaurus twisted free its horn, tearing a deep wound across the rival's chest. Both rose from the pool of blood, staining the water red. Breathing heavy, the two circled each other. Tails lashed mud into the air. Eyes locked with unbroken focus. Neither would retreat. Hunger, desperation, and pride demanded victory. The rival lunged, first jaws wide. Ceratosaurus sidestepped, barely avoiding the strike. With a counter, it sank its teeth into the rival's forearm, crunching bone. A roar of agony shook the swamp, yet the rival retaliated, slamming its tail into Ceratosaurus' ribs. The force sent the predator staggering across the mud. Ceratosaurus struggled to rise as blood ran down its side. Pain screamed across every nerve, yet the fire of survival burned brighter. It charged again, horn lowered. The rival met the attack with equal fury. Their skulls collided with a sickening crack echoing through the forest. Both stumbled, yet neither fell. The fight stretched on mercilessly. Wounds multiplied, blood poured into the swamp, mixing with rain. Flesh hung in tatters from their sides. Still neither surrendered. Each strike carried away life or death. At last the moment came. The rival lunged with jaws aimed at Ceratosaurus' throat. Time slowed. Instinct sharpened. Ceratosaurus twisted aside and drove its horn deep into the rival's neck. A roar of pain tore the sky as the horn pierced flesh and veins burst. The rival staggered, thrashing violently. Mud splashed in waves as it struggled. Ceratosaurus held its grip, twisting harder, forcing the wound deeper. The larger predator collapsed to its knees, blood streaming like rivers. With one final violent jerk, Ceratosaurus tore free. The rival fell to mud with a thunderous crash, shaking the ground. For a long moment silence returned. Only the labored breathing of the victor filled the swamp. Ceratosaurus stood above its fallen foe body, trembling and torn by wounds. Blood ran down its horn, dripping into the mud. The rival gave one last shudder before stillness claimed it forever. Ceratosaurus lifted its head and released a roar that shook the land. It was not only a cry of victory, but of survival and dominance. The swamp had chosen its ruler. Herds hidden deep in forest shadows trembled at the sound. Scavengers waiting nearby scattered in fear. The victor remained standing, though barely. Wounds burned across its body, ribs ached, and blood loss left its steps heavy. Yet the spirit of the predator remained unbroken. It had faced its equal and triumphed. The swamp belonged to Ceratosaurus. As the sun dipped low, painting the sky crimson, the predator turned from the fallen rival. Each step was slow, yet filled with strength. Hunger still pressed, yet now there was no rival to steal the prey. The swamp stretched vast and silent, ready to yield to its new ruler. Ceratosaurus vanished into the trees, leaving behind a battlefield marked with blood and broken earth. The legend of the horned predator grew that night. In the silence that followed, every creature knew its roar would rule the swamp for seasons to come. The swamp lay quiet after the storm of battle. Blood still drifted across the water's surface, carried slowly by the current into the reeds. The body of the fallen rival lay half submerged, its massive frame already drawing the attention of scavengers. Flies buzzed in thick clouds above the carcass, while distant carrion birds circled. The fight had ended, but its echoes lingered across the land. Ceratosaurus stood nearby, its chest heaving from exhaustion. Wounds covered its body, deep gashes lined its flanks, and dry blood clung to its horn. Every step brought pain, yet every breath carried life. It had survived the impossible. For a moment the predator simply stood still, listening to the swamp silence. This silence was no longer empty, but filled with respect. The fallen rival would not rise again. The swamp now belonged to one ruler. The herds hidden within the forest sensed a shift in power. They lifted their heads, cautiously sniffing the air. The predator who had claimed victory now dictated the rhythm of survival. Ceratosaurus moved slowly from the battlefield, dragging its tail through the mud. Each step left a heavy print that told the story of struggle and triumph. It did not linger over its rival. Victory was not celebrated with wasteful pride, but with quiet endurance. Survival itself was the prize. The predator found a patch of dry ground beneath twisted trees where it lay down to rest. Its body shook with pain as blood seeped into the soil. Yet within its chest the heart beat strong. Rest would be its ally. The swamp provided shade and shelter. Here it could recover before hunting again. Days passed. The body of the fallen rival became a feast for scavengers. Raptors darted between its bones, tearing scraps of flesh, while massive crocodiles dragged parts of it into the water. Life consumed death in an endless cycle. Ceratosaurus watched from the shadows as the swamp reshaped itself. One predator had fallen, yet another thrived. Such was the law of the land. During these days of recovery, the predator remained cautious. It drank from clean streams, avoiding the muddy pools that stank of decay. It hunted only when needed, taking small prey that required less strength. Young stegosaurs sometimes strayed too far from their herds and fell victim to its jaws. Fish too fattened by rains offered easy meals. The predator did not waste energy. Its survival was balanced carefully between hunger and recovery. The wounds began to heal. Scars formed across its shoulders and flanks, reminders of the brutal struggle. Each scar was a mark of dominance carved into its hide. The horn at its snout remained sharp, stained with dried blood, yet stronger than before. It had proven itself as both weapon and shield. Ceratosaurus' strength returned gradually. With each passing sunrise, it walked farther across its territory. The swamp stretched wide and rich in life. Herds of plant eaters moved cautiously across the marshes, but they no longer faced two rulers. Fear was unified beneath one roar. The balance of the swamp had shifted and stability returned. Storms rolled across the land, bringing heavy rains that filled rivers and deepened pools. Fish thrived in the swollen waters, while vegetation spread across the banks. With life renewed, the herds grew bolder. This boldness was dangerous. Ceratosaurus began to hunt with greater force once more. Each kill was decisive and swift. The predator's roar echoed over the swamp, announcing its rule. No rival dared to challenge it again. Smaller predators remained in shadows, scavenging the remains of its hunts. Crocodiles still lurked in the rivers, yet even they avoided direct confrontation. The victory over its equal had elevated Ceratosaurus to a new position. It was no longer just another hunter. It was the sovereign of the swamp. Yet survival never became easy. Storms sometimes destroyed nests, and floods swept away prey. Drought returned in brief waves, drying shallow pools. Each challenge demanded patience and strength. But Ceratosaurus endured. The scars across its hide reminded it that endurance was its greatest weapon. The herds learned too. They moved carefully through the swamps, never lingering near water at dusk. The scent of the predator kept them wary. The swamp became a stage where every creature acted with caution under the watchful presence of its horned ruler. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky burned red, Ceratosaurus climbed a ridge overlooking the swamp. From this height, it saw the rivers winding like silver through the land. Herds grazed at the edges while flocks of birds cut dark shapes against the light. All of it stretched wide beneath its gaze. The predator stood tall, its horned head lifted high. This was its kingdom carved through blood and survival. The swamp was no longer a place of equal rivals. It had become a domain of one. And though the cycles of life would continue, though one day even Ceratosaurus would fall, its legacy was already written in the mud and water. It had faced death and endured. Its roar had silenced all challengers. The predator turned from a ridge and disappeared once more into the trees. Behind it, the swamp pulsed with life, renewed under its watch. The fight that had nearly ended its existence had instead forged its reign. Ceratosaurus had not only survived, it had conquered. The swamp rested beneath a silver moon. Mist curled across the water, and shadows drifted between reeds. Ceratosaurus moved slowly along the bank, its steps heavy but certain. The night carried silence broken only by the distant croak of frogs and a rustle of insects. Every creature watched from cover as the horned predator passed. Its scars gleamed pale and the moonlight carved like stories across its hide. Each mark spoke of survival battles endured and victories claimed. The swamp had tested it with hunger and rival fury, yet it had never yielded. Strength had carried it beyond every storm. The herds that grazed by day kept their distance at night. They knew the rhythm of its hunts. They knew one mistake, one misstep, could bring its wrath. Yet even in their fear, there was a strange respect. The swamp lived in balance, shaped by the shadow of Ceratosaurus. On a ridge above the marsh, the predator paused. Its breath rose in white clouds against the cool night air. Below it, the land stretched endless, filled with pools, rivers, and forests alive with quiet motion. This was its domain claimed through blood. No rival walked here anymore. Ceratosaurus lifted its head and roared into the night. The sound rolled across the swamp, shaking reeds and echoing off distant cliffs. Frogs fell silent, birds scattered from trees, and even the rivers seemed to pause. The roar was not only hunger's cry. It was a proclamation of rule, carved into the very bones of the land. When the roar faded, silence returned heavier than before. Yet it was not the silence of emptiness. It was the silence of recognition. Every creature knew the predator's dominance. The swamp itself seemed to bow in quiet acknowledgement. Ceratosaurus turned and vanished into the shadows, leaving only the prints of its feet pressed deep into the soil. The water rippled, then stilled once more. Above, the moonlight glowed silver, painting the swamp in cold light. Legends are not always written in stone. Some are written in blood scars and echoes across the night. Ceratosaurus had become such a legend. Its horned silhouette would haunt the swamp long after its steps were gone.